Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of How to Talisman. If you missed episode 1, there'll be a link to it in the description box down below. And if you're an experienced Talisman player, you may want to check out some of the other Talisman content here on the channel. But for the rest of you folks, let's jump into character selection. So let's go ahead and start the game and select our character. Our choices are going to be somewhat limited, but there are still some pretty great characters available in the base game. One thing you're going to want to do, especially if you've never played this game before, is to go and look at the characters that have been presented to you, see what their strengths and weaknesses are, and what they can and can't do well. You actually select the character and then go and look at their character card. You can see here we have the elf. And each character is going to have special abilities that are unique to them. In this case, you need not roll in the forest unless you wish to. If you choose to roll, you must accept the result. Something to keep in mind if we're going to play this character is there are forest squares on the board, and if we land on that square, we will have the option to not roll the die as the square would normally require. Now, you may not understand the relevance of that being a first-time player, but it's still something to keep in mind in terms of what one character can do versus another in terms of deciding who you're actually going to play as. You may evade creatures and characters in the woods. So notice that there are two different kinds of squares on the board that we've already been made aware of. We have the forest and the woods, which are two different types of squares. There are actually multiple woods squares, but only one forest square on the board for us to worry about. If you are on the woods, instead of rolling the die for your move, you may move to any other woods in the same region. This is an ability to move around the board more easily if we so desire when playing this character. We also have a starting location, which is the forest, and an alignment, which is good. There are three alignments in the game: good, neutral, and evil. And various things that happen in the game and various items in the game are associated with a particular alignment. So being good alignment can be very beneficial to you in certain circumstances or very harmful to you in others. The same is true for evil alignment. As you might expect, neutral alignment tends to be rather neutral. So if you're worried about being positively or negatively affected by a lot of different things that can happen in the game, you might want to consider picking a neutral character for your first playthrough. But if you are more of a risk taker, a good or evil aligned character can lead to some pretty substantial benefits while opening you up to some potentially dangerous risks. The other thing you need to keep in mind when selecting a character is the statistics that they have, because Talisman is a game that has some RPG-like elements to it. You start out with a character that has stats like strength, craft, lives, fate, and gold, and a big part of the game is building up those stats throughout the course of the game so that you can access the more advanced portions of the board and eventually reach the center of the board, which is what allows you to win the game. So the higher a statistic is, the better as a general rule. Strength allows you to fight against creatures that are based on strength. Craft allows you to fight against creatures that are based on craft. Each time you lose a battle in the game, you lose a life. If you lose all of your lives, your character completely dies and you have to select a new character to continue in the game. Fate is a pretty interesting mechanic that's pretty unique to Talisman. What a fate point allows you to do is to one time re-roll the die in a variety of circumstances. So if you roll the die and a value comes up that you're not happy with or that's going to cause you problems in the game, you can spend a fate point to re-roll that once. Now you have to accept the outcome after spending that fate point, but it at least gives you a chance to get a better roll than what you got initially. And gold is very important in the game because it allows you to purchase items and deal with a lot of circumstances that can occur that are based on having money. Looking at the elf statistics, we've got a pretty well-rounded character here with 3 strength, 4 craft, 4 lives, 3 fate, and 1 gold. Most every character starts with at least 1 gold, but the stats that you're really going to care about the most in this game for picking a character are going to be fate, strength, and craft, pretty much in that order. Because we have at least 3 of each of those stats on this character, I'd consider this a pretty good character to consider starting the game with. And in fact, we may end up playing through this game as the elf for that very reason. But let's take a look at the other characters available to us and what their abilities are, just to contrast them versus the elf. So here we have the Prophetess. We begin the game with 1 spell. Spells are represented as cards drawn from a spell deck that you can use to do various things that are unique to each particular spell card. During the game, you always have at least 1 spell, so you gain a spell each time you cast your last spell. Now that's a pretty powerful ability because spells allow you to do a variety of things in the game, so that's something we definitely want to consider in terms of why we might want to select this character. Whenever you have to draw adventure cards, you may discard one of your choice that you do not wish to encounter and draw 1 more card to replace it, which you must encounter. The cool thing about this ability is it allows you to dodge a lot of the nastier cards that can come up in the adventure card deck. And it's actually a very powerful ability and something that can be used to good effect, especially for new players, to help them avoid some of the trickier snares that can occur in the game through card drawing. At any time during the game, you may look at the spell cards held by other characters. This is obviously a pretty powerful ability if the people you're playing against are holding a lot of spells, because you can see what they have in their hand and use that to determine what actions you might or might not take. The Prophetess starts at the chapel and has a good alignment, much like the elf. But you'll notice the powerful abilities the Prophetess has come at a bit of a cost. So rather than having 3 strength like the elf, she only has 2. She does have 4 craft, which is the same as the elf, and 4 lives. But you'll notice she only has 2 fate points. Now, fate is a very difficult thing for good characters in this game to replenish because there are very few options for them to actually get fate points back. So the fact that she only has 2 fate is something we're going to definitely want to consider when potentially selecting her for the game. Again, as normal, she has 1 gold. As a general rule, I would say the Prophetess is probably a bit more useful to more advanced players of the game. I wouldn't necessarily recommend her for a first-time play through the game, except for the fact that the ability to swap those adventure cards if something nasty comes up is a pretty potent and useful one. If we didn't have a character like the elf to choose from, I think I might consider going with the Prophetess for this first playthrough. But because we do have the elf as an option, we probably will bench the Prophetess for this time through the game. Now, we can also look at this Minstrel character, who is another one of the more advanced characters included in the initial set. Animals and dragons will not attack you, although you may choose to attack them. So that's a pretty useful ability, especially in the early game, because if some real powerful creature comes at you, you have the option to not fight it and potentially not lose lives when your statistics aren't good enough to actually conduct that fight properly. If you do not attack an animal, you may attempt to charm it. To do so, roll 1 die. If you roll higher than the animal's strength, it joins you as a follower and adds its strength to yours in battle. You may only use 1 charmed animal per battle. So, as you can imagine, the ability to take a creature that you encounter in the game and use it as an ally is potentially very powerful, but it's also something that's only going to be circumstantially useful. If, for example, a lot of animals don't come up early in the game, or a lot of dragon cards don't come up early in the game, you're not actually going to be able to take very much advantage of that ability. So while very cool, it's also very situationally useful. You may take the maiden and princess from any character you land on. Now, for those of you who've never played the game before, the maiden and the princess are follower cards. And one of the cool things about followers is you can have as many followers as you encounter. There's no real limit on how many of them you can have, unlike some of the other types of cards. So the ability to just randomly acquire additional followers from other players is a pretty powerful and useful one. But again, that hinges on the idea that those cards are actually in play in the game and possessed by another character. As you can see, the Minstrel has some pretty cool abilities that are selectively useful, which is why I tend to characterize him as a more advanced character. And you're also taking a bit more of a risk when selecting him because the things that he can do may or may not happen or may not occur during the course of a game. He starts at the tavern and has a good alignment. The interesting thing about this set of characters is we've only been presented with good characters, which means that no matter what we choose, we're going to have a good alignment. Now, much like the Prophetess, the Minstrel only has 2 strength, but also 4 craft. 4 lives, just like the Prophetess, but a whopping 5 fate, which is a pretty amazing amount of fate for a good character to have. You might suspect that the reason why he gets so much fate is because, as I mentioned before, his abilities are so selectively useful, so you may have to re-roll the dice quite a bit to make up for how he lacks in other abilities, or if his abilities are not immediately useful. So, given these 3 choices, I think the elf is going to be the one we want to go with, simply because his base strength is a little bit higher than these other 2. His abilities are more generally useful, and he's got a sufficient amount of fate where we should be able to deal with most anything that comes up initially that isn't working to our advantage. It might not seem like a big deal, but that little 1 extra point of strength as a base statistic actually is going to end up factoring in heavily to this game.